Hello everyone, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be fun if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin, my friend. When Jake and I decided to take a road trip through Texas, we had been planning it for months. We wanted to see the rural parts of the state, far from the big cities. We packed up the car and hit the road, eager for the adventure. After a long day of driving, we needed a place to crash for the night. We found a small, run-down motel just up the highway. It looked a bit sketchy, but we were too tired to keep driving. The neon sign flickered as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The manager was an older guy, probably in his late 50s. He seemed friendly enough, maybe a bit too friendly. He gave us a room key and told us to let him know if we needed anything. The room was basic, just 2 beds, a TV, and a small bathroom. It smelled a bit musty, but we didn't care, we just wanted to sleep. After getting settled, Jake turned on the TV while I took a shower. When I came out, Jake was already half asleep, the TV playing some late-night infomercial. I lay down and tried to relax, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, just an uneasy feeling in the back of my mind. I shrugged it off and closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. It sounded like a faint buzzing. I sat up and looked around the dark room, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Jake was still asleep, snoring softly. The noise seemed to be coming from behind the TV. I got up and moved closer, squinting in the dim light. That's when I saw a tiny hole in the wall right behind the TV. I leaned in closer, peering into the hole. It was too dark to see anything, but the buzzing noise was louder now. My heart started to race. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to get a better look. There was a small black device in the hole, and it was definitely a camera. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. Why was there a camera in our room? I shook Jake awake, trying to stay calm. He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he mumbled. "There's a camera," I whispered, pointing to the hole behind the TV. His eyes widened as he grabbed his phone and looked for himself. "What the hell?" he muttered, now fully awake. We started searching the room, looking for more cameras. It didn't take long to find them. There was one in the air vent, another in the bathroom mirror, and one more in the smoke detector. Someone had been watching us the whole time. Jake wanted to confront the manager right away, but I convinced him we needed to be careful. If this guy was shady enough to put cameras in our room, who knows what else he was capable of? We decided to gather our stuff and get out of there as quickly and quietly as possible. We packed up in record time, checking for any more hidden cameras as we went. My hands were shaking as I zipped up my bag. We crept out of the room, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The motel was eerily silent, not a single sound except for our footsteps. As we reached the car, I glanced back at the motel office. The manager was there, watching us through the window. His friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. He knew we had found the cameras. We jumped into the car and sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from that place. When we finally pulled over at a gas station, Jake called the police. They told us to come to the nearest station to file our report. At the station, we told the officers everything. They seemed to take it seriously, assuring us they would investigate. We gave them the address of the motel and all the details we could remember. As we left the station, I felt a bit of relief, but the fear was still there, gnawing at me. Over the next few days, we tried to put the incident behind us, but it wasn't easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tiny hidden cameras and the manager's cold stare. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. A week later, Jake called me with some news. He had done some digging online and found out that the motel manager had been arrested. The police had found a whole network of hidden cameras in the rooms, all connected to a live stream on the dark web. Dozens of people had been unknowingly filmed, their private moments broadcasted to who knows how many strangers. The news made me sick to my stomach. We had been lucky to get out of there unharmed, but the thought of what could have happened haunted me. I deleted my social media accounts and changed my phone number, paranoid that someone might still be watching. To this day, I can't stay in motels or hotels without thoroughly checking for cameras. I don't trust anyone who seems too friendly, and I always keep my guard up. I found myself driving along the winding coastal roads of Oregon, seeking a quiet retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. The motel I stumbled upon seemed perfect, an unassuming building nestled between towering pines and overlooking the rugged coastline. The owner, Mr. Johnson, greeted me warmly as I checked in, his smile friendly yet slightly unnerving. The room was clean and cozy, adorned with nautical decor that matched the seaside charm. I unpacked my bags and settled in, enjoying the peaceful sound of waves crashing against the shore. Mr. Johnson was attentive, offering suggestions for local sites to explore and even bringing me a complimentary bottle of wine that evening. But as the days passed, I started noticing peculiarities. Mr. Johnson would linger a little too long during our conversations, asking personal questions that made me uneasy. He seemed overly interested in my plans and whereabouts, almost as if he was keeping track of my every move. One afternoon, while exploring the motel grounds, I stumbled upon a shed at the back of the property. It was locked, but through a gap in the boards, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a collection of photographs and small objects. Curiosity piqued, I made a mental note to investigate further that night. Unable to shake off my unease, I decided to take a closer look. I waited until Mr. Johnson retired to his living quarters and then quietly made my way to the shed. With a bit of effort, I managed to pry open the lock and step inside. What I found sent chills down my spine. The shed was filled with photographs, faces of guests I had seen around the motel, including mine. Each photograph was accompanied by a small item, a hairbrush, a piece of jewelry, even a worn-out shoe. It dawned on me that these were Mr. Johnson's trophies, mementos he had collected from his guests. Fear gripped me as I realized the extent of his obsession. I hastily snapped a few pictures with my phone as evidence, my hands trembling with disbelief. Just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through me as I realized Mr. Johnson must have discovered my intrusion. I barely had time to hide behind a stack of crates when he entered the shed, a flashlight in hand. His expression was cold and calculating, a stark contrast to the friendly demeanor he had shown me earlier. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the open lock, and then began muttering to himself. Heart pounding, I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for him to leave. Finally, he turned and walked out, locking the shed behind him. I waited a few more agonizing moments before daring to move. I made my way back to my room in a daze, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I knew I had to leave immediately, but I couldn't risk confronting Mr. Johnson again. I hastily packed my belongings, leaving behind anything that might slow me down. As I reached the parking lot, I noticed Mr. Johnson standing near the reception area, his gaze fixed on the shed. I knew he must have suspected someone had been there. With my heart in my throat, I quietly slipped into my car and started the engine, praying he wouldn't notice me. I drove away as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The coastal scenery that had seemed so serene only days before now felt ominous and threatening. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I booked a room in a busy hotel, surrounded by other guests and far away from Mr. Johnson's motel. I reported the incident to the local authorities, showing them the photographs I had taken as proof. They assured me they would investigate but warned that without concrete evidence of criminal activity, their hands were tied. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Johnson had been watching me, even from afar. In the days that followed, I couldn't sleep properly, haunted by the realization of how close I had come to becoming one of Mr. Johnson's trophies. I kept imagining what might have happened if he had caught me in the shed. The thought sent shivers down my spine. Months passed, and eventually, I learned from a news report that Mr. Johnson had been arrested on unrelated charges. They found evidence. linking him to a string of burglaries in the area, but there was no mention of his disturbing collection of trophies. I tried to put the ordeal behind me, but the memory of that coastal Oregon motel and its sinister owner still lingers. Working the night shift at the distribution center in New Jersey was usually uneventful. The warehouse was massive, with aisles stretching out in every direction, filled with boxes and crates. The silence of the night was only broken by the hum of forklifts and the occasional chatter on walkie-talkies. I liked the quiet, the monotony. It was easy money, and I didn't mind the hours. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 10 p.m., grabbed my checklist, and started my rounds. It was just me and a handful of other workers, spread out across the facility. Most of them kept to themselves, and I didn't know them well, just nodded in passing and kept to my tasks. Around midnight, I was doing inventory in one of the far aisles when I heard hushed voices coming from the loading dock. It struck me as odd because the dock was supposed to be closed and locked up at this hour. Curiosity got the better of me, so I crept closer, staying in the shadows. I peeked around a stack of crates and saw a small group of my coworkers huddled together. There was Tony, the shift supervisor, and a couple of guys I recognized but didn't know by name. They were unloading boxes from a truck that wasn't on any of the manifests. The way they moved, fast and furtive, set off alarm bells in my head. I strained to hear what they were saying. "Make sure everything's accounted for," Tony said. "We can't afford any mistakes tonight." One of the other guys nodded. "Yeah, the boss won't be happy if anything goes missing. You know how he is." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My heart started pounding. It was clear they were up to something illegal, and I was in way over my head. I thought about just walking away, pretending I hadn't seen anything. But as I took a step back, my foot hit a loose piece of wood, and it made a loud crack. The conversation stopped abruptly. Tony's head snapped up, and his eyes scanned the area. I ducked behind the crates, holding my breath. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hard and suspicious. I didn't move a muscle. I could hear my own heartbeat loud in my ears. After a moment, Tony seemed to dismiss it. "Probably just a rat," he muttered. "Let's get this done." I waited until they were back to work before I slowly backed away and made my way to the break room. My mind was racing. What should I do? Report them? But to whom? Tony was the shift supervisor, the one person I'd normally go to with any issues. And what if they found out it was me who snitched? They could make my life hell, or worse. I decided to play it cool for the rest of the shift. I went about my tasks, avoiding the loading dock and keeping to myself, but the images of them unloading those boxes kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. When the shift ended at 6 a.m., I clocked out and headed to my car. The cold morning air felt good against my skin, but it didn't clear my head. I drove home in a daze, barely registering the familiar sights along the way. All I could think about was what I'd seen and what I should do next. That evening, I couldn't sleep. I kept tossing and turning, my thoughts a jumbled mess. Around midnight, I got up and decided to do some research. I looked up drug trafficking operations and the penalties for getting involved. It was serious stuff. People went to prison for years for what Tony and the others were doing. The next night at work, I kept my head down and did my job, trying to act normal. But every time I saw Tony or the other guys, I felt a surge of anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that they knew I'd seen something, that they were watching me. A week passed, and I was a wreck. I barely slept, and I was constantly looking over my shoulder. One night, as I was finishing my shift, Tony cornered me in the break room. "Hey, got a minute?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes hard. "Sure," I replied, my heart racing. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it. "You've been acting strange lately. Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could feel the sweat on my forehead. "You know, it's important to stay focused on the job. Distractions can be dangerous." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Good," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Keep it that way." After he left, I sat down, my legs feeling weak. It was a warning, plain and simple. I knew then that I had to do something. I couldn't keep living like this, in fear every day. But I had to be smart about it. The next night, I waited until Tony and the others were busy with their illicit activities. I snuck into the office and used the phone to call the anonymous tip line for the police. I kept my voice low, giving them all the details I could without revealing my identity. I hung up, my heart pounding. I hoped I'd done the right thing. All I could do now was wait. The following night, the warehouse was raided. Police swarmed the place, arresting Tony and his crew. I stayed out of sight, my heart in my throat, as they were led away in handcuffs. It was over. In the days that followed, I was questioned by the police. I played dumb, pretending I had no idea what was going on. They seemed to buy it, and eventually, things started to return to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling of paranoia. Even though Tony and the others were gone, I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid that someone would come after me for what I'd done. It's been a few months now, and I've finally started to feel like I can breathe again. But I'll never forget those nights in the warehouse, the fear, and the sense of danger that hung over me. I learned a lot about myself through this ordeal, about courage and fear and the lengths I'd go to protect myself. I hope I never have to go through something like that again, but if I do, at least I know I can handle it. I always wanted a classic car. It was a dream of mine for years. So when I found one for sale in Philadelphia, I jumped at the chance. It was a 1967 Mustang, in pretty good shape, and the price was reasonable. The seller, a guy named Mike, seemed nice enough. He was eager to sell and told me he needed the money quickly. I didn't ask too many questions. I met Mike at a rundown garage on the outskirts of town. The place looked abandoned, but the Mustang was there, gleaming under a layer of dust. We made the deal, and he handed over the keys. I drove the car home, feeling like I had just scored the deal of a lifetime. The first sign of trouble came the next day. I was at a red light when a black SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a guy inside stared at me hard. I looked away, trying to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes burning into me. The light turned green, and I drove off quickly, but the SUV followed me for several blocks before finally turning away. That night, I heard noises outside my house. It sounded like someone was messing with the car. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but by the time I got outside, no one was there. The car was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I was driving to work when the SUV appeared again. This time, it was right on my tail. I tried to lose them, weaving through traffic, but they stayed with me. Finally, I pulled into a crowded parking lot and ran inside a store, hoping they wouldn't follow. They didn't, but when I came back out, there was a note on my windshield. It said, "We know who you are." I decided to call Mike. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried a few more times, but no luck. I started to get really worried. That evening, I noticed the SUV parked down the street from my house. They were watching me. The next morning, I found my tires slashed. I called a tow truck and had the car taken to a nearby garage. The mechanic told me it would take a few days to get new tires and fix some other minor issues. I felt a bit of relief, thinking maybe things would calm down without the car around. But that night, someone broke into my house. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass and footsteps downstairs. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the stairs, heart pounding. There were two men in my living room, rummaging through my stuff. They saw me, and one of them lunged. I swung the bat, hitting him in the side. He went down, but the other guy pulled a knife. I backed up, trying to keep the bat between us. He slashed at me, and I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I swung the bat again, hitting his arm and knocking the knife away. He tackled me, and we both went down hard. I managed to get on top of him and hit him again until he stopped moving. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived within minutes and arrested the two men. I was taken to the hospital, where I got stitches for the cut on my arm. The police questioned me about the men, but I didn't know anything. They took my statement and promised to look into it. A few days later, I got a call from a detective. He told me that the men who broke into my house were part of a gang, and they were looking for something they thought Mike had left in the car. He wouldn't say what, but it sounded serious. The detective advised me to stay somewhere safe until they could sort things out. I stayed with a friend for a while, hoping the police would catch the rest of the gang. They kept the Mustang as evidence, which was fine by me. I didn't want anything to do with it anymore. Eventually, the police busted the gang, and things started to calm down. They returned the car, but I sold it as soon as I could. I didn't want any more trouble. I worked late shifts at a small office in Montana, handling data entry for a local business. It was a quiet job, perfect for someone like me who enjoyed solitude. The office was in a secluded part of town, surrounded by empty lots and an old warehouse. It never bothered me, though. I liked the peace and quiet. One night, around 10 p.m., the phone rang. It startled me because the office phone rarely rang, especially not at night. I picked it up, thinking it might be my boss checking in. "Hello?" I said. There was silence for a moment, then a raspy voice said, "I see you're working late again, Sarah." My heart skipped a beat. How did they know my name? I tried to stay calm. "Who is this?" The line went dead. I shook it off, thinking it might be a prank, but it left me feeling uneasy. I decided to finish my work quickly and head home. The next night, the phone rang again at the same time. I hesitated but picked it up. "Hello?" The same voice. "Nice blue sweater, Sarah. It looks good on you." I looked down at my sweater, my heart racing. How could they see me? I ran to the window and peered outside but saw nothing but darkness. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but it felt too real. I called my friend Jenny and told her about the calls. She offered to stay on the phone with me while I finished my work. It helped a little, having her voice in my ear, but I was still jumpy. The calls kept coming, night after night. Each time, the voice knew more about me, my schedule, my clothes, even what I had for lunch. I reported it to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more information. They advised me to keep a log of the calls and to be cautious. One night, I decided to try to catch the caller. I left the phone off the hook, hoping it would frustrate them. It did. Around 10:15, my cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. "You think you're clever, don't you?" the voice hissed. "You can't hide from me." I hung up and called the police again, but they still couldn't help much. They suggested I change my number and consider getting a security system for the office. My boss wasn't too keen on the extra expense, but he agreed after hearing my story. I installed cameras around the office and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. For a few days, things were quiet. I started to relax, thinking maybe the caller had given up. Then one night, I was reviewing some documents when the office phone rang. My heart sank. I checked the security feed but didn't see anything unusual. I picked up the phone, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Who is this? What do you want?" The voice laughed, a chilling sound that made my skin crawl. "I'm closer than you think, Sarah. Much closer." I hung up and checked the security feed again. Nothing. I decided to leave early. As I was packing up, I heard a noise from the back room, a faint creaking sound. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my things and ran out of the office, locking the door behind me. The next day, I showed the security footage to the police. They found nothing unusual, no sign of anyone near the office. They suggested it might be someone I knew, but I couldn't think of anyone who would do this to me. I started staying with Jenny, not wanting to be alone. She lived a few miles away, and the commute was longer, but I felt safer. We set up a system where she would call me at 10 p.m. every night to check on me. One night, While at Jenny's, I got a call from an unknown number. My heart pounded as I answered. "Hello?" The voice was calm, almost friendly. "Miss me, Sarah?" I dropped the phone and backed away, my legs shaking. Jenny grabbed the phone and shouted into it, but the caller had already hung up. We called the police again, but there was little they could do. They suggested I take some time off work. My boss agreed, understanding my fear. I stayed with Jenny, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. A week later, I went back to work, feeling a little better with the security measures in place. But the calls started again, this time on my cell phone. The voice was more menacing, more demanding. It felt like a never-ending nightmare. One night, as I was leaving the office, I noticed a car parked down the street. It hadn't been there before. I got into my car and drove home, constantly checking my rearview mirror. The car followed me. My heart raced as I pulled into Jenny's driveway. I ran inside, locking the door behind me. The car parked outside, and I watched as a figure got out and approached the house. I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. Jenny grabbed a baseball bat, ready to defend us. The police arrived just as the figure reached the front door. It was a man in his 40s, disheveled and angry. They arrested him and found out he had been stalking me for weeks. He had installed hidden cameras in the office and had been watching my every move. The police assured me he would be charged and that I would be safe now. I changed my number, moved to a new apartment, and tried to move on with my life. But the fear never really went away. I always double-check my locks, and I never stay late at work anymore. It's a terrifying experience that I wouldn't wish on anyone. The feeling of being watched, of not knowing who to trust, stays with you. I'm grateful to be safe now, but I'll never forget those nights in the office, wondering if I would make it out alive. I was driving alone in the outskirts of Las Vegas, the city lights fading behind me as I headed towards the empty desert. The road stretched out ahead, dark and desolate, with nothing but the occasional cactus and tumbleweed for company. It was late, and I was tired, but I wanted to make it to my destination before calling it a night. As I drove, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another traveler on the road. But then the car got closer, tailgating me and flashing its high beams. I frowned, wondering why they were driving so aggressively. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the road ahead, but the car didn't let up, swerving dangerously close to my bumper and then falling back again. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach, realizing that this was no ordinary driver. They were deliberately trying to intimidate me. I sped up, hoping to lose them, but they matched my speed, staying right on my tail. Panic surged through me as I realized they weren't going to give up easily. I had to do something before they caused an accident. I glanced at my phone, debating whether to call the police, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the road for even a second. Instead, I focused on staying calm and getting away from the other car. I saw a turnoff up ahead, a narrow dirt road leading into the desert. Without thinking, I veered off the highway and onto the rough terrain. The car followed, its headlights bobbing over the bumps and dips in the road. I pushed my car to its limits, weaving through the desert landscape in a desperate attempt to escape. But no matter how fast I drove or how many twists and turns I made, the other car stayed right behind me, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the driver's face, illuminated by the glow of the dashboard lights. They were wearing a ski mask, their eyes fixed on me with a chilling intensity. My blood ran cold as I realized they weren't just trying to scare me, they meant to do me harm. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I realized I was in a fight for my life. I had to outsmart my pursuer and find a way to get help. But out here, in the middle of nowhere, with no one around for miles, that seemed like an impossible task. I spotted a cluster of rocks up ahead, a potential hiding spot where I could make a stand. I slowed down, waiting until the last possible moment before swerving off the road and ducking behind the boulders. The other car screeched to a halt behind me, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin searchlights. I held my breath, waiting for them to find me, but but seconds ticked by and there was no sign of movement. I risked a glance around the edge of the rock, my heart pounding in my chest. The other car was parked a few yards away, its engine idling, but there was no sign of the driver. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, they would find me, and then I would be defenseless. I had to come up with a plan, and fast. I reached into the glove compartment and grabbed a flashlight, flicking it on and shining it toward the other car. I didn't see anyone inside, but that didn't mean they weren't out there, waiting for me to make a move. I took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the rock, keeping the flashlight trained on the other car. I moved slowly, my senses on high alert, ready for anything. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, the crunch of gravel underfoot. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And that's when I saw them, the driver, emerging from the shadows with a knife in their hand. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out of this nightmare. But before I could react, they lunged at me, the glint of the blade flashing in the moonlight. Instinct took over, and I dodged out of the way, feeling the rush of air as the knife sliced through the space where I had been standing. Adrenaline surged through me as I fought back, swinging the flashlight like a weapon and aiming for their head. There was a sickening thud as the flashlight connected with their skull, and they stumbled backward, dazed. I didn't hesitate. I ran, my feet pounding against the hard desert ground as I sprinted toward my car. I could hear them behind me, cursing and shouting threats, but I didn't look back. I reached my car and jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I started the engine and peeled out of the dirt road, leaving the other car and its driver far behind me. As I drove, my hands shook on the wheel and tears streamed down my face. But I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the nearest town, where I called the police and reported what had happened. They promised to investigate, but I knew it would be hard to find someone in the vast expanse of the desert. I never found out who was chasing me that night or why they had targeted me, but I'll never forget the terror I felt as I fought for my life in the middle of the desert, with no one around to help. I was working the night shift as a janitor in a high-rise office building in downtown Chicago. The building was quiet as usual, and I was just doing my rounds, emptying trash bins and vacuuming the carpets. It was a pretty standard night until I got to the 15th floor. I stepped out of the elevator with my cleaning cart. The lights were dim for the night. The silence was comforting, like every other night. I headed to the first office and started my routine. As I was finishing up, I heard a faint noise, like someone talking. I ignored it at first, thinking it might be coming from another floor, but then I heard it again, louder this time. I paused, trying to listen more closely. It was definitely coming from down the hall. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. I walked quietly down the hallway, the voices getting clearer. They were coming from one of the larger conference rooms. As I got closer, I realized the door was slightly ajar. I peered through the crack and saw 3 men inside, all dressed in black and wearing masks. They were armed with guns and were rifling through the drawers and cabinets. My heart started pounding. I knew I shouldn't be there, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. One of the men looked up, and I quickly ducked back, hoping he hadn't seen me. I backed away slowly, trying to get back to the elevator, but my foot caught on the edge of a carpet, and I stumbled, making a noise. The talking inside the room stopped. I heard footsteps approaching the door. Panicking, I looked for a place to hide. There was a supply closet a few feet away, and I darted inside, closing the door as quietly as I could. I could hear them now, their footsteps echoing in the hallway. They were looking for me. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. "Did you see anyone?" one of them asked. "Yeah, someone was definitely out here," another replied. "Find them. We can't let them leave." I stayed as still as possible, clutching a mop handle like it was a weapon. The footsteps grew louder, and then they were right outside the closet. The doorknob turned, and I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the worst. The door creaked open, and I felt a cold breeze as it swung inward. I opened my eyes just a sliver and saw a pair of boots. One of the men stood there, scanning the room. He didn't see me, tucked behind the door. After what felt like forever, he turned and walked away. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. I knew I needed to get out of there, but I didn't know how. I waited until I couldn't hear their footsteps anymore, then quietly crept out of the closet. I headed for the stairwell, thinking it might be safer than the elevator. As I pushed open the stairwell door, it made a loud creak. I cringed, hoping they hadn't heard it. I started down the stairs, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. I was almost at the next landing when I heard the door above me burst open. "There he is," one of them shouted. I ran faster, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear them behind me, their footsteps getting closer. I reached the 12th floor and shoved open the door, darting into the hallway. I needed a place to hide, but the offices were all locked. I kept running, looking for anything that might help. I turned a corner and found myself in another hallway, this one lined with cubicles. I ducked into one, trying to catch my breath. I could hear them in the stairwell, searching for me. I needed a plan, and fast. I spotted a phone on one of the desks and grabbed it, dialing 911 with shaking hands. The operator answered, and I whispered as quietly as I could, explaining what was happening. They told me to stay on the line and that help was on the way. I heard footsteps again, closer this time. I hung up and crouched lower, praying they wouldn't find me. One of the men walked past the cubicles, looking around. He was so close I could see the sweat on his forehead. He stopped, looking right at the cubicle I was hiding in. I held my breath, my heart pounding. He took a step closer, and I knew I was done for. But then a noise from the other end of the hallway caught his attention. He turned and walked away, heading toward the sound. I took the opportunity to move, crawling on my hands and knees to another cubicle further down. I needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of them. I could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. I just needed to hold out a little longer. I made it to the end of the hallway and found a small storage room. I slipped inside and closed the door, hoping it would buy me some time. The sirens were louder now, and I could see flashing lights outside the window. I heard the men shouting, panicking as they realized the police were arriving. I stayed hidden, listening as they ran down the hallway, trying to escape. The sound of their footsteps faded, and then it was quiet. I waited, afraid to move. Finally, I heard voices, but these were different. The police were here. I slowly opened the door and stepped out, hands raised. An officer saw me and rushed over, guiding me to safety. They searched the building and found the men trying to escape through a back exit. They were arrested, and I was taken outside, where I finally felt like I could breathe again. I sat on the curb, shaking as the officers asked me questions. I told them everything, from the moment I saw the men to the chase through the stairwell. They reassured me that I was safe now, but I couldn't shake the fear. It was a night I'd never forget. What started as a normal shift turned into a nightmare. I was just a janitor trying to do my job and ended up in the middle of a robbery. I checked into the motel on a rainy afternoon. It was the only place for miles, a small building nestled among the trees on a quiet road in New England. I had been driving for hours and needed a place to rest. The woman at the front desk was polite but distant, giving me a key to a room at the far end of the hallway. The lobby was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. My room was basic but clean. I dropped my bags, took a quick shower, and settled in. I planned to leave early the next morning, so I set my alarm and crawled into bed. The rain outside was soothing, and I started to drift off to sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to muffled voices. They were coming from the room next door. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was an urgency in their tone that made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the voices grew louder, and I could hear footsteps pacing back and forth. Curiosity got the better of me, and I got out of bed, pressing my ear to the wall. I could only catch fragments of the conversation, words like shipment, security, and timing. My heart started to race. It sounded like they were planning something big. The next morning, I went to the lobby to get some coffee. The same woman from yesterday was there, but now she was joined by a man who looked equally unfriendly. They both watched me closely as I poured my coffee. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I walked back to my room, I noticed a few other guests in the hallway. They were all men, dressed in dark clothes, and they all seemed to be watching me. I quickly went back to my room and locked the door. I needed to figure out what was going on. I spent the day in my room, trying to gather my thoughts. Around midday, I heard a knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat. I cautiously opened it, and a guy I hadn't seen before was standing there. He asked if I needed anything, but his eyes were cold and calculating. I said no and quickly shut the door. By now, I was convinced that something illegal was happening. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to raise suspicion. I decided to wait until nightfall, hoping I could slip away unnoticed. As the evening approached, I packed my bags and waited for the right moment. Around midnight, the voices next door started up again. It was my chance. I quietly opened my door and peered down the hallway. It was empty. I made my way to the lobby, but as I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see one of the men from the hallway approaching. Panic set in, and I bolted out the door, running to my car. I fumbled with my keys, finally getting the door open, and jumped in. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man standing in the doorway, watching me leave. My heart was pounding, but I kept driving, not daring to look back again. I drove for hours until I reached the next town. I found a diner and went inside, shaking and exhausted. I sat down and ordered a coffee, trying to calm my nerves. I overheard a conversation at the counter about a big heist that had been thwarted nearby. The pieces started to fall into place. The people at the motel were part of a crime syndicate, and I had stumbled into their midst. They had been planning a major heist, and I had been a potential witness. I realized how lucky I was to have gotten out unscathed. I eventually made it to my destination, but the experience left a lasting mark. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had been caught. It made me more cautious, especially when traveling alone. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, hearing those voices in my head, and I remember the cold, calculating eyes of the man at my door. I took a job at a gas station in a deserted area of Nevada. It wasn't much, but it was work. The station was old, and the nearest town was miles away. I liked the quiet at first, the isolation, but that changed fast. It was a late shift, around midnight, when I first noticed him, a man, maybe in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. He came in for gas and stood by the counter for a long time, just staring at me. His eyes were dark, empty. "Need anything else?" I asked, trying to sound friendly. He shook his head and left without a word. I watched him drive off, his beat-up old truck disappearing into the night. Something about him unsettled me, but I shrugged it off. An hour later, I went outside to take a break. That's when I saw the spray paint on the side of the building, big red letters spelling out something I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. My heart sank. Vandalism was the last thing I needed. I went back inside, grabbed a flashlight, and took a closer look. It was a mess of symbols and words, none of it making any sense. I felt a chill. Who would do this, and why? I decided to call my boss in the morning and report it. For now, I just wanted to get through the night. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise from the back of the station. It sounded like metal scraping against metal. I grabbed the flashlight and went to check it out, my hands shaking as I turned the corner. The beam of light caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was there. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. I took a few steps closer, and that's when I saw him, the same man from earlier, crouched by the storage shed, a crowbar in his hand. "What are you doing?" I shouted, fear creeping into my voice. He stood up slowly, a menacing grin spreading across his face. Just fixing things, he said, his voice cold and mocking. Get out of here, or I'm calling the cops, I threatened. But he didn't move. Instead, he took a step towards me. I don't think you'll do that, he said, and I realized he was right. The nearest police station was too far, and there was no way they'd get here in time. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight trained on him. He laughed, a low, chilling sound, and turned back to the shed. I ran inside, locked the door, and grabbed the phone. My hands were trembling so much I could barely dial. When I finally got through to the police, they told me to stay put and they'd send someone as soon as they could. Hours passed, each minute stretching into an eternity. I kept watching the security monitors, but he was gone. I hoped he'd given up and left, but the damage was done. I knew he wasn't just some random vandal, he was targeting me. Around 4 a.m., the phone rang. I jumped, my heart pounding. It was my boss. I explained what happened, and he promised to come by in the morning. I hung up, feeling a little better, but I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sun started to rise, casting long shadows across the desert. I was exhausted, but I knew I had to stay alert. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard a loud crash from the front of the station. I ran to the door and looked outside. The man's truck was back, and he was smashing the windows with a tire iron. "Stop it!" I shouted, but he ignored me. I ran back inside and grabbed the only weapon I had, a baseball bat I kept behind the counter for protection. My hands were sweating, and my breath was coming in short gasps. When I got back outside, he was standing by the pump, the tire iron hanging loosely from his hand. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I don't want any trouble," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Just leave, and we can forget this ever happened." He shook his head slowly. "It's too late for that," he said, and lunged at me. I swung the bat, but he was faster. He knocked it out of my hands and shoved me to the ground. Pain shot through my arm as I landed hard on the concrete. He stood over me, the tire iron raised, and I knew I was out of options. "Please," I begged. "Just go." He paused, and for a moment, I thought he might actually listen. But then he smiled, a cruel, twisted smile, and raised the tire iron higher. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. Just then, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. His smile faltered, and he looked around, panicked. The sirens grew louder, and he took a step back. "You got lucky," he spat, and ran to his truck. I lay there, watching as he sped off, the sound of the sirens chasing him into the desert. The police arrived moments later, finding me bruised and shaken but alive. They took my statement, and I watched as they drove off in pursuit of the man. I knew they'd probably never find him. He was just a shadow in the night, a reminder of how vulnerable we really are. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't stay there, not after what happened. The station was just a building, but it held too many memories of fear and pain. I packed up my things and left Nevada, hoping to leave the terror behind. But even now, in the safety of my new home, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't think I'll ever truly feel safe again. I saw a beautiful old piano for sale in a small shop in Las Vegas. I couldn't resist. It was a grand piano with a rich, dark finish and ivory keys that felt smooth under my fingers. The shop owner said it had a history, once owned by someone famous, but he didn't say much more. I didn't care about the history, I just wanted the piano. I had the piano delivered to my apartment the next day. It fit perfectly in my living room, and I spent hours playing it, losing myself in the music. It wasn't until a week later that things started to get strange. One evening, I came home from work and found my front door slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. I stepped inside cautiously. Nothing seemed out of place, but the piano lid was open. I never left it open. I felt a chill but dismissed it, thinking I must have forgotten. That night, I woke up to the sound of someone playing the piano. The notes were soft, almost ghostly. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the living room, but no one was there. The piano lid was closed. I stood there, heart pounding, convinced I was losing my mind. The next morning, I found a note on my doorstep. It said, "We know you have it. Return it, or else." I had no idea what it meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was about the piano. I called the shop owner, but his number was disconnected. I went to the shop, but it was closed, the windows boarded up. That evening, 2 men showed up at my door. They were dressed in dark suits and looked serious. One of them showed me a photo of the piano and asked if I had it. I lied and said no, but they didn't believe me. They pushed past me and searched my apartment. When they saw the piano, one of them smiled. "You have something that belongs to us," he said. "We need it back." I tried to explain that I bought it from the shop, but they didn't care. They insisted that the piano once belonged to a notorious mobster and that it had something valuable hidden inside. They demanded I let them take it, but I refused. It was my piano, and I wasn't going to give it up. The men left, but they made it clear they would be back. I was terrified. I couldn't sleep that night, jumping at every sound. The next day, I went to the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without more information. I felt helpless. A few nights later, I woke up to find the men in my apartment again. This time, they weren't alone. They had brought tools and were determined to take the piano apart. I tried to stop them, but one of them grabbed me and held me back. They dismantled the piano piece by piece, but they didn't find anything. Frustrated, they turned their attention to me. They demanded to know where the hidden item was. I had no idea what they were talking about. They didn't believe me. One of them pulled out a knife, and I thought that was the end. Just then, there was a loud knock on the door. The men froze. The knocking grew louder, more urgent. They exchanged glances and then fled out the back door, leaving me shaken and alone. I ran to the door and opened it to find a neighbor, concerned about the noise. I was too scared to explain and just thanked him. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the men were long gone. The police took my statement and promised to keep an eye on my apartment. They suggested I stay somewhere else for a while, but I had nowhere else to go. I was too scared to stay, but I didn't want to leave my home. A few days later, I received another note. It said, "Last chance. Give it back, or you'll regret it." I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed a bag and left town, staying with a friend in another city. Working as a security guard in a luxury apartment complex in Miami was supposed to be an easy gig. I had been at it for about 6 months, and most of my shifts were uneventful. The place was upscale, and the residents mostly kept to themselves. I spent my nights making rounds, watching the cameras, and occasionally dealing with noise complaints or parking issues. One night, while I was doing my routine check, I noticed something odd on the security feed. One of the residents, a guy named Mr. Vargas, was bringing a lot of people into his apartment. At first, I thought maybe he was having a party, but it was a Tuesday night, and he kept doing it every other night. The people he brought in always seemed nervous, looking around like they were scared. I didn't think much of it until a week later when I was making my rounds on the top floor where Mr. Vargas lived. As I walked past his door, I heard muffled cries. It sounded like someone was pleading. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door, but I didn't knock. I decided to check the cameras again instead. Back at the security office, I rewound the footage and watched closely. The people he brought in were always different, and they never left. My stomach tightened as I thought about what could be happening in that apartment. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something felt very wrong. I debated with myself for days. Should I report this? What if I was wrong? What if it was nothing, and I lost my job over a misunderstanding? But the gnawing feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The next time I was on shift, I saw Mr. Vargas bring in a young woman. She looked terrified. That was the tipping point. I decided I had to do something. I called my supervisor and told him what I had seen. He dismissed it, saying it was probably just a misunderstanding. I felt frustrated and helpless. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do more. I decided to confront Mr. Vargas. I waited until he left his apartment and then knocked on the door. No one answered, but the door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The place was dark and smelled musty. I followed the sound of muffled voices to a back room. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was filled with makeshift beds, and there were people, men, women, even a couple of teenagers, all looking scared and malnourished. They were chained to the walls. I backed out of the room and left the apartment as quickly as I could. I called the police from the security office, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. I told them everything and waited for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When the police arrived, they raided the apartment and freed the people inside. Mr. Vargas was arrested, and the story made the local news. He was part of a human trafficking ring, using his apartment as a holding place before moving his victims elsewhere. The complex's management wasn't happy that I had gone into the apartment without permission, but they couldn't fire me after what had happened. The residents were shaken, and the complex installed more security measures to prevent something like this from happening again. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of those people. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't done anything. The fear and the guilt were overwhelming. Eventually, things settled down. I still work at the complex, but I'm more vigilant now. I check every camera feed twice, and I don't hesitate to report anything suspicious. It's a lesson I learned the hard way. Sometimes doing the right thing is terrifying, but the consequences of doing nothing are even worse. Looking back, I'm glad I followed my instincts, even though it was one of the scariest things I've ever done. The people we saved are getting the help they need, and Mr. Vargas is behind bars where he belongs. I was vacationing in Georgia, staying at a small motel just off the highway. It wasn't anything special, but it was clean and cheap. I arrived late in the afternoon, tired from the long drive. The place was almost empty, just a few cars in the lot. I checked in, got my key, and headed to my room. The room was simple, with a bed, a small TV, and a bathroom. I threw my bags on the bed and decided to take a walk to stretch my legs. The area around the motel was quiet, just a few trees and the distant hum of a highway. I felt a bit uneasy, but I brushed it off as just being tired. When I got back to my room, I noticed someone had checked into the room next door. The blinds were drawn, but I could hear muffled voices. I didn't think much of it and went about my evening, grabbing a quick dinner from a nearby diner. Back in my room, I settled in to watch some TV. The voices next door were louder now but still muffled. It sounded like an argument. I turned up the volume to drown it out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The arguing continued, rising and falling in intensity. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I turned off the TV and pressed my ear to the wall. The voices were clearer now, a man's voice, low and threatening, and a woman's voice, pleading. My stomach knotted as I realized this wasn't just a regular argument. I debated what to do. Calling the front desk seemed pointless. The motel manager didn't strike me as someone who'd get involved. I didn't want to call the police without more information, but I couldn't just ignore it either. The voices grew louder, the man's tone more aggressive. I decided to take a closer look. I slipped out of my room and walked down the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible. I stood outside the door to the next room, straining to hear. The man was saying something about staying quiet and not causing trouble. The woman was crying, begging him to let her go. My heart pounded. This was serious. I pulled out my phone and started recording, needing some evidence if I was going to call the police. Suddenly, the door to the room opened. I froze, not knowing what to do. The man stepped out, glancing around before closing the door behind him. He didn't see me, but I got a good look at him, tall, muscular, with a shaved head and a menacing look in his eyes. He walked down the hall, and I quickly ducked back into my room. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade away before I called the police. I explained what I had heard and seen, hoping they would take it seriously. They assured me they were sending someone right away. I stayed by the door, listening for any sign of the man's return. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police arrived, and I stepped out to meet them, pointing them to the room next door. They knocked, identifying themselves. There was no answer at first, but then the door opened. The man tried to act calm, but the police weren't buying it. They pushed past him and found the woman inside, tied to a chair and clearly terrified. They quickly arrested the man and freed the woman. She was in shock but otherwise okay. I gave my statement to the police, showing them the recording I had made. They thanked me for my help and assured me the man would be charged. The woman was taken to the hospital, and I was left standing there, shaken by what had just happened. The rest of my vacation was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman and what might have happened if I hadn't acted. I didn't get much sleep that night, jumping at every sound. By morning, I was ready to leave that motel behind. As I packed up my things, the motel manager knocked on my door. He apologized for what had happened and offered me a refund, but I just wanted to get out of there. I thanked him and left as quickly as I could. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I had stumbled into something terrible, but at least I had done something to help. The experience left me wary of places like that, reminding me that you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. We were on a cross-country trip, just me and my friend Mark. We had been driving for hours, and our stomachs were growling. We saw a sign for a diner in a small town, so we decided to stop and grab a bite. It was one of those classic, old-fashioned diners with a neon sign and a few cars parked outside. We went in and sat at a booth near the back. The place was mostly empty, just a couple of locals at the counter and an older waitress who looked like she had been working there forever. We ordered burgers and coffee and settled in, enjoying the break from the road. As we waited for our food, we couldn't help but overhear a conversation coming from the booth behind us. At first, it was just a low murmur, but then it got louder. Two men were talking, and what they were saying sent a chill down my spine. "They won't find the bodies for weeks," one of them said. We made sure of that. Mark and I exchanged glances. We tried to keep our faces neutral, but I could see the worry in his eyes. The other man replied, "We need to be careful. If anyone saw us, we're done for." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. We hadn't seen anyone when we came in, but now I was nervous. The waitress brought our food, and we tried to act normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we had heard. I glanced over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of the men. They looked rough, like they were used to trouble. We ate quickly, hardly tasting the food. I whispered to Mark, "We need to get out of here." He nodded, and we paid the bill and left a tip on the table. As we walked to the car, I felt a sense of urgency. We got in and drove off, but my mind was racing. What had we just overheard? Were those men serious? We decided to call the police and report what we had heard. They took our statement and said they would look into it. We continued our trip, but the encounter left us both uneasy. It was a reminder that you never know what kind of people you might run into, even in the most unexpected places. We were talking and now just staring. We walked out of the diner, trying to act casual, but as soon as we were outside, we hurried to the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking. Mark kept glancing back at the diner. "Hurry up," he urged. I finally got the door open and we jumped in. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, my heart pounding. We drove back to the main road, but I noticed in the rearview mirror that a truck had pulled out of the diner right after us. "It's them. They're following us," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark looked back and cursed under his breath. "What do we do?" he asked. "Just drive," I said. "We need to lose them." I pressed the gas pedal and sped up, but the truck stayed right on our tail. We were on a lonely stretch of road, no other cars in sight. The sun was setting, and the shadows were getting longer. I tried to think of a plan, but my mind was racing. "We need to find somewhere to hide," Mark said. "We can't outrun them." I scanned the sides of the road, looking for anything that might help us. Up ahead, I saw a dirt road leading off into the woods. "Hold on," I said, and turned sharply onto the dirt road. The car bounced and jolted as we sped down the rough path, but the truck followed, its headlights bouncing in the rearview mirror. The road twisted and turned, and I tried to stay ahead, but they were getting closer. I saw a clearing up ahead and turned into it, slamming on the brakes. We jumped out of the car and ran into the woods, branches slapping at my face and arms as we ran, but I didn't stop. I could hear the men shouting behind us, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush. My heart was pounding and my breath was ragged. I had no idea where we were going, just that we had to keep moving.
We stumbled into a small ravine and slid down the side, landing hard at the bottom. I could hear the men searching above us, their voices getting closer. Mark and I pressed ourselves against the dirt wall, trying to stay silent. "They went this way," one of the men shouted. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find us. The seconds stretched into minutes, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then the voices started to fade, they were moving away. We stayed still, hardly daring to breathe until we were sure they were gone. Finally, I whispered, "We need to keep moving." Mark nodded and we climbed out of the ravine, careful to stay quiet. We made our way through the woods, putting as much distance between us and the men as we could. It was dark now, and the forest was eerily quiet. After what felt like hours, we stumbled onto another road. We had no idea where we were, but we followed it, hoping it would lead us to safety. Eventually, we saw headlights in the distance, a car was coming. We stepped out onto the road and waved it down. The car stopped, and a middle-aged couple rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, concern in her voice. "We need help," I said. "Please, just take us to the nearest town." They let us in, and we explained what had happened as they drove. They took us to the nearest police station, where we reported everything. The police took our statement and said they would investigate, but I didn't have much hope they would find the men. We were exhausted but grateful to be safe. The couple who had picked us up offered to drive us to a nearby motel, and we accepted. As we settled into the motel room, I couldn't shake the fear that still clung to me. We tried to get some sleep, but every noise outside made me jump. I kept thinking about what those men had said in the diner and how close we had come to being their next victims. It was a long night, but eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. The next morning, we decided to cut our trip short and head home. We were both shaken by what had happened and just wanted to put as much distance as possible between us and that town. As we drove, we stayed vigilant, watching for any sign of the truck. It took a while, but we finally started to feel a bit safer. We knew we had been lucky to get away. Traveling through South America had always been a dream of mine. I had saved up for years and finally took the plunge. I started in Argentina, making my way through Chile, Peru, and then Colombia. Each country had its own charm, and I felt more alive than I had in years. I arrived in Colombia with high spirits. The people were friendly, the food was amazing, and the scenery was breathtaking. I spent a few days in Bogota before heading to Medellin. It was there that I met a group of locals. They seemed nice, always smiling and inviting me to join them for drinks and meals. We quickly became friends. One evening, they suggested a trip to a secluded part of the jungle. They said it was a hidden gem, a place tourists never see. They promised waterfalls, exotic wildlife, and an authentic experience. I was hesitant but also intrigued. I agreed to go. We set out early the next morning. The group consisted of Juan, the leader, along with Carlos, Maria, and a few others. They seemed excited and kept the mood light with jokes and laughter. We took a jeep deep into the jungle, far from any towns or cities. The road was rocky, but the scenery was beautiful. After a few hours, we arrived at a small clearing. One said we would need to hike the rest of the way. We grabbed our backpacks and set off on foot. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but one assured us it was the right way. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. The jungle was dense, and the sounds of wildlife were all around us. We walked for what felt like hours. The sun was starting to set, and I was beginning to worry. I asked one how much farther it was, and he just smiled and said we were close. We finally reached a small campsite with a few makeshift huts. One said this was where we would spend the night. As we settled in, I noticed that Carlos and Maria were whispering to each other, occasionally glancing in my direction. My unease grew, but I tried to shake it off. We sat around a campfire, and one passed around a bottle of local liquor. I took a sip, but my nerves were too frayed to enjoy it. When it got dark, the atmosphere changed. Juan's friendly demeanor vanished. He and the others became quiet, almost tense. I felt trapped. Suddenly, Juan stood up and walked over to me. He looked down with a cold, hard stare. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and threatening. Before I could react, Carlos and another man grabbed me, forcing me to my feet. They dragged me to one of the huts and threw me inside. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. They locked the door from the outside, leaving me in darkness. Panic set in. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one responded. I tried to think of a way out. The walls of the hut were thin, made of wooden planks. I started to kick at them, hoping to break through. After several tries, one of the planks gave way, creating a small hole. I squeezed through, scratching my arms and tearing my shirt.
Once outside, I saw that the campfire was still burning, but the group was nowhere in sight. I needed to get away fast. I remembered the trail we took in and decided to follow it back. I ran through the jungle, my heart pounding in my chest. The sounds of the night were deafening. I stumbled over roots and rocks, cutting my hands and knees. I heard voices behind me, shouting in Spanish. They were coming after me. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain and fear. I had to find the jeep and get out of there. The jungle seemed endless, but I kept going. Finally, I saw the clearing ahead. The jeep was still there, parked where we left it. I reached the jeep and yanked the door open. The keys were still in the ignition. I jumped in and started the engine, praying it would start. The jeep roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, speeding down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, I saw Juan and the others burst from the trees, shouting and waving their arms. They were too late. I drove as fast as I could, not daring to slow down until I was far away. When I finally reached a town, I went straight to the police. They took my statement and sent officers to the jungle, but I never found out what happened to Juan and his group. I left Colombia the next day, shaken but relieved to be alive. The experience haunts me to this day. I had trusted those people, thinking they were friends. It was a harsh lesson about trust and the dangers that can lurk behind friendly faces. I took a job at a plant in Ohio, working the night shift. It was isolated, surrounded by fields and far from any town. The plant itself was old, a maze of machinery and dimly lit corridors. Most nights were quiet, just the hum of the machines and the occasional sound of my own footsteps echoing through the halls. One night, though, things changed. It started with whispers among my coworkers during breaks. They seemed tense, glancing around nervously when they thought no one was looking. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my tasks and keeping to myself, but the unease in the air was palpable. Around midnight, I was making my rounds when I heard raised voices coming from one of the control rooms. I hesitated, unsure if I should intervene or pretend I didn't hear anything. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached quietly, peering through the small window in the door. I saw several of my coworkers gathered around a computer screen. They were huddled close, talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their expressions were serious, almost frantic. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. What were they up to? Were they planning something? I debated whether to confront them or report it to our supervisor. Before I could decide, one of them noticed me standing there. "Hey, what are you doing?" he asked sharply, stepping towards me. I tried to stammer out an excuse, but he cut me off. "Mind your own business," he growled, and the others nodded in agreement. I backed away, my mind racing. Something was definitely going on, something they didn't want me to know about. I spent the rest of the shift on edge, watching my coworkers closely. They avoided me, speaking in hushed tones whenever I walked by. I felt like a stranger in my own workplace, surrounded by people I couldn't trust. As the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a pair of eyes, every creak of the floorboards made my heart skip a beat. I was alone, vulnerable, and unsure who I could turn to for help. Around 3 a.m., I decided to investigate further. I waited until the control room was empty and slipped inside. The computer screen was still on, displaying a complex diagram of the plant's systems. It looked normal at first glance, but something about it made my skin crawl. I scrolled through the files, searching for anything out of the ordinary. That's when I found it, a document labeled Plan. My hand shook as I opened it, revealing detailed instructions on how to sabotage the plant's machinery. My stomach churned. They were planning to cause a major malfunction, endangering everyone inside. Panic set in as I realized I had stumbled onto something dangerous, something that could have catastrophic consequences. Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around to see my coworkers standing there, blocking my only exit. Their faces were twisted with anger and betrayal. "You weren't supposed to see that," one of them hissed, advancing towards me. I backed away, my mind racing for a way out. They outnumbered me, and I knew I couldn't fight them off. "Please," I begged, my voice trembling, "just let me go." They laughed, a cold, menacing sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Can't do that," another one said, pulling something from his pocket. It glinted in the dim light, a wrench, heavy and menacing. I looked around desperately, searching for anything I could use as a weapon, but the room was bare, the walls closing in around me. I was trapped, helpless. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we can talk about this. There's no need for violence." But they ignored me, closing in with grim determination. I backed into a corner, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Just as they were about to strike, the door burst open behind them. Light flooded the room, silhouetting a figure in the doorway, our supervisor, accompanied by security guards. They had come to investigate after hearing rumors of a disturbance. The intruders froze, caught off guard. In the chaos that followed, the guards subdued them one by one. I sank to the floor, shaking with relief and disbelief. I was safe, but the horror of what had almost happened lingered. The police arrived soon after, taking statements and gathering evidence. My coworkers were arrested, their plan thwarted before it could be carried out. I watched as they were led away in handcuffs, their faces filled with rage and defeat. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't go back, couldn't face the memories of that night. The plant was shut down temporarily for investigation, and I heard rumors that it might close for good. It didn't matter to me. All I wanted was to put it behind me, to forget the terror and move on with my life. But the nightmares persisted, haunting me in the quiet moments before sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, of staring into the face of evil and barely escaping with my life. It changed me, left me with scars that would never fully heal. Now, I work a different job in a different city. I try to focus on the present, on rebuilding what was lost. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and my thoughts drift back to that dark room, I wonder if they'll ever come back for me, if the horror will ever truly be over. I watched the figure as Jake approached from the side, but then the figure disappeared into the shadows. Jake ran to where the figure had been but found nothing. I slumped in my chair, overwhelmed by fear. The phone rang once more. 911, what's your emergency? I heard the voice say, I'll be back, before the line went dead for the final time. Jake returned, shaking his head. He's gone, but we'll find him, he said. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and anxiety. When my shift ended, I couldn't leave fast enough. The experience haunted me for days, the voice echoing in my mind, but I was determined never to let my guard down again. I was driving through Arizona, aiming to reach New Mexico by the next day. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. I was tired from the long drive and needed a place to rest for the night. I spotted a small roadside motel, the kind with a neon sign flickering on and off. It seemed as good a place as any to stop. I pulled into the gravel parking lot and walked into the office. The man behind the counter looked to be in his 50s, with thinning hair and a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He checked me in, handed me a key, and gave me directions to my room, located towards the back of the lot. The room was basic but clean enough, with a bed, a small table, and a TV. I locked the door and settled in, looking forward to a good night's sleep. After a quick shower, I lay down on the bed, scrolling through my phone. Something didn't feel right, but I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place. As I was about to drift off to sleep, I noticed a small red light blinking in the corner of the room. I got up to investigate and found a hidden camera tucked behind the air vent. My heart started pounding. I scanned the room and found another camera hidden behind a painting on the wall. Panic set in as I realized there could be more. I quickly packed my things and decided to confront the motel owner. As I stepped outside, I saw him standing by the office, watching me. His smile was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating look. I approached him, trying to keep my voice steady. "There are cameras in my room," I said firmly. "I want my money back, and I'm leaving." He didn't seem surprised. Instead, he pulled out his phone and showed me a live feed from one of the cameras in my room. "You don't want to leave," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Unless you want everyone to see these videos." My stomach turned. He was blackmailing me. I felt trapped and helpless. He told me to go back to my room and wait for further instructions. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. I considered calling the police, but what if he had connections? What if they didn't believe me? I returned to my room, feeling more vulnerable than ever. I couldn't stay here, but I also couldn't leave without risking the footage being released. I needed a plan. I checked my phone and found that the reception was spotty, making it difficult to call for help. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't answer, hoping whoever it was would go away, but the knocking continued, more insistent this time. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was the motel owner. "Open the door," he said, his voice muffled but clear. "We need to talk." I didn't respond. I backed away from the door, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. The only thing that came to mind was the lamp on the bedside table. I picked it up, my hand shaking. The door handle jiggled, and I realized he was trying to get in. I needed to act fast. I threw the lamp at the window, shattering the glass. The noise startled him, and I took the opportunity to climb out the window, cutting my hands on the broken glass. I ran towards my car, not looking back. I could hear him shouting, but I didn't stop. I fumbled with my keys, finally managing to unlock the door. I jumped in and started the engine, my hands still trembling as I sped out of the parking lot. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was standing in the doorway, watching me with that same cold look. I drove for miles, not stopping until I reached a larger town. I found a police station and reported what had happened. The officers took my statement and assured me they would investigate. They offered me a safe place to stay for the night, which I gladly accepted. The next day, I received a call from the police. They had raided the motel and found multiple hidden cameras in several rooms. The owner was arrested and charged with multiple counts of voyeurism and extortion. They assured me the footage would be destroyed and that I was safe. It took me a while to shake the feeling of being watched, but eventually, I started to feel normal again. I was a journalist on the trail of a big story, a series of mysterious disappearances in a small town that had the whole community on edge. I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. So when I received a tip about a possible lead in the surrounding forest, I didn't hesitate to investigate. Armed with my notebook and camera, I set out into the woods, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, the trees closed in around me, their branches blocking out the sunlight and casting long shadows on the forest floor. I tried to stay focused, but the eerie silence of the woods unnerved me. I pressed on, following a faint trail that seemed to lead deeper into the heart of the forest. With each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, like I was being watched by unseen eyes. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I stumbled upon a clearing in the trees, a clearing that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. In the center of the clearing stood a group of people dressed in tattered robes, chanting in a language I didn't understand. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, realizing that I had stumbled upon a sinister cult hiding in the woods. They seemed to sense my presence, turning towards me with eyes that gleamed with madness. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before they noticed me, and I became their next victim. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with reckless abandon. But the cultists were hot on my heels, their shouts echoing through the forest as they pursued me. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with exertion as I struggled to put distance between us. I didn't dare look back as I ran, the fear and panic driving me forward. It felt like hours before I finally emerged from the trees, gasping for breath and covered in sweat. But even as I collapsed on the forest floor, relief flooding through me, I knew that I couldn't rest for long. The cultists were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. With a shaky breath, I forced myself to stand and keep moving, determined to put as much distance between me and the sinister force that lurked in the depths of the forest. I pushed aside my fear and pressed on, my senses on high alert as I navigated the treacherous terrain. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a shiver down my spine as I searched for a way out. Then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw it, a break in the trees up ahead, a glimmer of light that promised safety and salvation. With renewed determination, I pushed myself towards it, ignoring the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm me. Finally, I burst through the trees and into the open air, gasping for breath as I emerged into the daylight. I collapsed on the ground, exhausted and shaken but alive. I took the job at the remote Colorado motel because it seemed peaceful and away from the city. The place was old but well kept, run by an older man named Mr. Thompson. He was a quiet guy, not very talkative. The motel had a serious silence about it, especially at night when the wind howled through the pine trees surrounding it. My job was simple, checking in guests, cleaning rooms, and making sure everything ran smoothly. Most of the time, there weren't any guests. It felt like the world had forgotten about this place, but the pay was decent, and the solitude didn't bother me. One night, I was doing my rounds, checking that all the doors were locked. I passed by the office where Mr. Thompson usually worked late. The door was slightly open, and I heard voices inside. Curious, I peeked through the gap. Mr. Thompson was talking to two men in suits. They looked out of place in this rundown motel. Their conversation was low, but I caught words like shipment and money. It didn't sit right with me. As I was about to walk away, the floorboard creaked. The men stopped talking. I quickly moved down the hall and into the laundry room, my heart pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, I noticed strange things. Unmarked vans would arrive late at night. Mr. Thompson was more secretive, often locking himself in the office for hours. One evening, after all the guests had checked out, I decided to take a closer look. I waited until Mr. Thompson left for his usual late-night drive. I went to the office and tried the door. Locked. I remembered a spare key in a supply closet and fetched it. My hand shook as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The office was cluttered with papers and old furniture. I looked around, searching for anything unusual. Then I noticed a small door behind a bookshelf. It was almost hidden. I pushed the bookshelf aside and opened the door. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down to a basement. The air was musty and cold. I descended the stairs slowly, the steps creaking under my weight. At the bottom was another door, this one reinforced with metal. I pushed it open and froze. The room was filled with boxes and crates, all marked with symbols I didn't recognize. There were tables covered in documents, maps, and photographs. It looked like a scene from a crime movie. As I moved further in, I saw a large safe against the wall. I didn't have much time. I heard the sound of gravel crunching outside. Mr. Thompson's car. Panic set in. I quickly looked through the papers on the table, trying to find anything that could explain what was going on. Drugs, weapons, money laundering. It was all here. I heard the office door open upstairs. My heart raced as I tried to find a place to hide. There was a small closet in the corner of the room. I squeezed inside and pulled the door shut just as I heard footsteps on the stairs. Mr. Thompson entered the room, followed by the two men in suits. They were discussing a new shipment. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. My mind raced with thoughts of what they would do if they caught me. They stayed in the room for what felt like hours, checking the contents of the crates and going over their plans. I couldn't make out everything, but it was clear they were involved in something big and dangerous. Finally, they started to leave. I waited until I was sure they were gone before I dared to move. I slipped out of the closet and back up the stairs, quietly closing the door behind me. I put the bookshelf back in place and locked the office door, my hands still shaking. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things quickly but carefully. I had to get out without arousing suspicion. I left a note saying I had a family emergency and had to leave suddenly. Then I got in my car and drove away, my heart still pounding as I drove through the dark, winding roads. I couldn't shake the fear that they might come after me. I had stumbled onto something dangerous, and I knew too much. I kept driving until I reached the next town, where I found a small, cheap motel and checked in. The next day, I went to the police. I told them everything I had seen and heard. They took my statement seriously and promised to investigate. I gave them the location of the hidden room and the evidence I had seen. A few weeks later, I heard that Mr. Thompson had been arrested, along with several others involved in the operation. The motel was shut down and searched thoroughly. The police found more than I had seen: weapons, drugs, money, all part of a large criminal network. I never went back to that motel. The experience left me shaken, but I was grateful to have gotten out alive. I had always loved vintage dresses. They were my passion, my hobby, and I had collected them for years. My closet was full of beautiful, unique pieces from different eras, but I needed the money, so I decided to sell my collection. I put an ad online and soon got a response from a man named Daniel. He seemed polite and very interested in buying the whole collection. Daniel came to my apartment in Nashville to look at the dresses. He was about my age, in his early 30s, with a clean-cut appearance and an easy smile. He complimented my taste and seemed genuinely fascinated by each dress. We chatted for a bit, and he asked a lot of questions about where I found them, what my favorite pieces were, and if I had more. It felt like talking to a fellow enthusiast, and I didn't think much of it. After a while, he decided to buy several of the dresses. He paid in cash and left with his purchases. I felt a mix of sadness and relief as I watched him walk away. It was hard parting with my beloved dresses, but I needed the money more. A few days later, I started noticing Daniel around my neighborhood. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, maybe he lived nearby or worked in the area, but then I saw him more frequently. He was always just a little too close for comfort, always glancing my way with that same polite smile. One evening, as I was leaving my apartment, I found Daniel standing across the street. He didn't say anything, just watched as I got into my car. My skin crawled, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just passing by, I told myself. The next day, I saw him again at the grocery store. He was in the same aisle, casually browsing, but his eyes were on me. I hurried through my shopping and left as quickly as I could, my heart pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That night, I heard noises outside my apartment, footsteps, a rustling sound, and then a soft knock on my door. I froze, listening. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. Daniel was standing there, his expression calm and patient. He knocked again, and my heart raced. I didn't know what to do. My mind was a whirl of fear and confusion. Why was he here? What did he want? I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away slowly, praying he would leave. After a few minutes, he finally did, but I couldn't sleep that night. I kept hearing his knocks in my head. The following days were a blur of anxiety. Everywhere I went, I saw Daniel, at the coffee shop, the park, even my workplace. It was like he was always one step behind me, always watching. I started to feel trapped, unable to escape his gaze. I went to the police, but they didn't take me seriously. Without any direct threats or violence, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to be cautious and call if anything happened. I felt helpless and alone. One evening, I came home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. Panic set in as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The place looked untouched, but I knew something was wrong. I checked every room, my hands shaking, but found nothing out of place. Then I saw it. On my bed was one of my vintage dresses, the ones Daniel had bought. He had been in my apartment. He had a key. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of him. They took my statement, but there was little they could do without any solid evidence. I changed the locks and stayed with a friend for a few days, but the fear didn't go away. I felt like a prisoner in my own life, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering when he would show up next. One night, I heard a noise outside my friend's house. I looked out the window and saw Daniel standing in the yard, staring up at me. That was the last straw. I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. I packed my things and decided to leave Nashville. It was the only way to escape him. I moved to a new city, changed my number, and tried to rebuild my life. I was home alone with my infant son, just relaxing in the living room, when I heard it, footsteps coming from the nursery. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I rushed to investigate, fear clawing at my chest. The nursery was dark, with only the soft glow of a nightlight illuminating the room, but when I got there, I found the crib empty. Panic set in as I realized my son was gone. I felt like my world was crumbling around me, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. I searched the room frantically, tears streaming down my face, but there was no sign of him. He was just gone. That's when I noticed it. The window was open, despite it being securely locked just moments before. My blood ran cold as I realized someone had taken him. I felt sick to my stomach, like I was going to throw up. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream, to run outside and search for him, but I knew I had to stay calm, to think clearly. I called the police, my hands shaking as I dialed the numbers. I tried to explain what had happened, but I could barely get the words out. I was so scared, so helpless. I searched the house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The police arrived soon after, but they couldn't find anything either. They said they'd do everything they could to find him, but I knew it was too late. He was gone, and I was left alone with this unbearable grief. I felt like I was suffocating, like I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to cry out in agony, but I couldn't. I was numb, trapped in this never-ending nightmare. Days turned into weeks, but there was still no sign of him. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was trapped in this never-ending cycle of grief and despair. Then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard it, the sound of a baby crying. My heart leapt into my throat as I rushed to investigate. I found him outside, in the arms of a stranger. Relief washed over me as I scooped him up, holding him close like I'd never let him go. The stranger explained that they had found him abandoned in a nearby park. I didn't care about the details. All that mattered was that he was safe, that he was back in my arms where he belonged. I thanked the stranger profusely, tears streaming down my face. They said they were just glad they could help, then disappeared into the night. I held my son close, feeling like the luckiest person alive. I didn't know who had taken him or why, but none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that he was safe and that we were together again. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. I had taken a small boat to one of the tiny uninhabited islands off the coast of Maine. I had planned to fish and just enjoy the solitude. The island was perfect, isolated with a small beach and a dense forest in the middle. I set up my tent near the beach, got a fire going, and spent the day fishing and exploring. By late afternoon, the weather had turned. Dark clouds gathered, and the wind picked up. I decided to call it a day and headed back to my camp. As I was securing my gear, I noticed a boat approaching the island. It seemed odd because this island was pretty far from the main coastline, and I hadn't seen any other boats all day. 3 men got off the boat. They waved and walked over. They were dressed like fishermen, with weathered faces and rough clothes. They introduced themselves as Tom, Bill, and Eddie and said they were out fishing and had seen my campfire. They asked if they could join me for a bit to wait out the weather. It seemed harmless enough, so I agreed. We sat around the fire, and they shared some of their catch. They seemed friendly at first, asking about my trip and what I did for a living. But as the evening wore on, their questions became more personal, and their demeanor started to change. They asked why I was out here alone, if anyone knew I was here, if I had a family waiting for me back home. Tom, the apparent leader, began talking about the island in a way that made me uncomfortable. He mentioned how easy it would be for someone to disappear out here, how nobody would hear a scream over the wind and waves. His tone was light, almost joking, but there was an edge to it that set off alarm bells in my head. I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but it was clear something was off. Bill and Eddie kept glancing at each other, then at me. The atmosphere grew tense, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I decided it was time to end the evening. I thanked them for their company and suggested they head back to their boat before the storm hit. Tom laughed, a harsh, mocking sound, and said they weren't in a hurry. He stood up, towering over me, and said they had nowhere else to be tonight. His eyes were cold, and his smile didn't reach them. Bill and Eddie stood up too, flanking him, their expressions unreadable but menacing. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I was in trouble. I tried to stay calm and told them I was tired and needed to get some sleep. Tom shook his head, still smiling that cold smile, and said they weren't done talking. He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed up, feeling the heat of the fire on my legs. Then, without warning, Eddie lunged at me. I dodged and ran toward the tent, but Bill grabbed my arm, twisting it painfully. I struggled, kicked, and managed to break free. I sprinted into the forest, my only thought to get away. The wind howled through the trees, and rain started to pour down, turning the ground to mud. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, shouting angrily. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, roots tripping me. My foot caught on something, and I went down hard, tasting dirt and blood. I scrambled up, heart pounding, lungs burning, and kept running. I found a small hollow under an old tree and squeezed myself into it, trying to make as little noise as possible. I could hear them nearby, their voices raised, cursing and calling for me. I held my breath, willing myself to be invisible. The minutes dragged by, each one an eternity. The rain pounded down, masking some of the noise, but not enough to drown out their voices. Eventually, their voices faded, and I dared to breathe again. I waited, shivering and soaked to the bone, until I was sure they were gone. Slowly, I crawled out and made my way back to the camp, staying low and quiet. The fire had died down, and the camp was empty. Their boat was still there, but there was no sign of the men. I grabbed my pack and slipped down to the beach, heading for the boat. If I could get to the mainland, I could find help. I pushed the boat into the water and climbed in, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the oars. I rode with all my strength, the muscles in my arms burning, my mind filled with the fear that they would hear me, that they would come back and finish what they started. The storm made the crossing treacherous, but I didn't care. I kept rowing until I could see the lights of the mainland. I stumbled onto the shore, exhausted and terrified, and found a small diner still open. I called the police, and they came quickly, taking my statement and searching the island. They found the campsite, but the men were gone, leaving no trace behind. I never found out who they were or what they really wanted. The police said I was lucky to be alive, and I knew they were right. I haven't been back to that island or any other since. I was looking forward to a peaceful camping trip in the remote forest of Idaho, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the sounds of nature. But what I encountered there was far from peaceful. As the sun began to set, I settled into my campsite, eager to unwind after a long day of hiking through the wilderness. But as darkness fell, a sense of unease settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. That's when I noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush, coming closer and closer to my campsite. My heart began to race as I strained to listen for any sign of who or what was approaching. Suddenly, I heard the sound of someone fumbling with the door of my van, their movements quick and furtive. I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to catch whoever was trying to break in. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I crept towards the van, trying to stay hidden in the shadows as I approached. But as I drew closer, I realized I was too late. The door was already open, swinging wide to reveal the dark interior of the vehicle. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do next, but as I listened to the sounds of someone rummaging through my belongings inside the van, I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to protect myself and my belongings. With a surge of adrenaline, I launched forward, grabbing hold of the intruder and pulling them out of the van with all the strength I could muster. They stumbled and fell to the ground, their face obscured by the darkness of the night, but as they scrambled to their feet and turned to face me, I recoiled in horror. It was a stranger, their face twisted into a mask of rage and desperation as they glared at me with wild eyes. I tried to reason with them, to ask them why they were trying to break into my van, but they were beyond reason, their mind consumed by some unseen force that drove them to madness. With a sickening realization, I knew I had to get away from this person as fast as I could. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush as I tried to put as much distance between me and the crazed intruder as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, they were always right behind me, their footsteps echoing through the forest as they pursued me with relentless determination. I ducked and dodged through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest as I desperately tried to lose them in the darkness. But they were always one step ahead of me, their presence looming over me like a shadow in the night. I stumbled and fell, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I struggled to keep moving, but as I looked up, I saw the glint of moonlight on metal, a knife held in the hand of the person who was chasing me. With a surge of fear unlike anything I had ever felt before, I pushed myself to my feet and kept running, driven by the primal instinct to survive at all costs. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I stumbled upon a clearing in the forest. Without hesitation, I dashed towards the safety of the open space, hoping against hope that I could find some way to escape my pursuer. But as I reached the edge of the clearing, I came face to face with a sheer drop-off, a steep cliff that plummeted down into the darkness below. I skidded to a halt at the edge, my heart sinking as I realized I had nowhere left to run. With my back against the cliff, I turned to face my attacker, their crazed eyes burning with manic intensity as they closed in on me with outstretched hands. In that moment, I knew I had to fight back with everything I had if I wanted to survive. With a scream of death, I launched myself at them, throwing punches and kicks with reckless abandon as I fought to defend myself against their onslaught. But they were too strong, overpowering me with ease as they pinned me to the ground with a fierce grip. I struggled and thrashed, but it was no use, they had me trapped, at their mercy, in the heart of the forest. Just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. I looked up to see a group of hikers emerging from the trees, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they hurried towards me. With a final burst of energy, I managed to break free from my attacker's grasp and scramble to my feet. The hikers wasted no time in coming to my aid, surrounding me and driving my attacker back with shouts and warnings. Together, we fled into the safety of the night, putting as much distance between us and my would-be assailant as possible. I checked into the motel late, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a small, run-down place in rural Kentucky, the kind you pass by without a second thought. I was traveling through for work, needing a place to sleep before heading out early the next morning. The manager, a burly man with a thick southern accent, handed me the key to room 6. He didn't say much, just nodded and went back to watching his TV. The room was as expected, old, musty, with a bed that creaked and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I tossed my bag on the bed and decided to take a quick shower before getting some sleep. The water was lukewarm at best, and the pressure was almost non-existent. I didn't care, I just wanted to wash off the day's grime and relax. After my shower, I settled into bed with a book. It was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the occasional car passing by on the highway. I was starting to drift off when I heard a knock at the door. I looked at the clock, 11:30 p.m. odd, I thought. Maybe it was the manager needing something. I got up, wrapped a towel around myself, and peered through the peephole. There were 3 men standing outside, looking impatient. They didn't look like motel staff. I hesitated, unsure whether to open the door. Then one of them spoke up, his voice gruff. "We know you're in there. Open up, we need to talk." I cracked the door open just enough to see them clearly. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're the one who checked in today, right?" the same man asked. "Yes, why?" "Come on out." "We need to have a chat," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. "I don't think that's necessary. I'm just here for the night and leaving early tomorrow," I said. The man exchanged a look with his companions. "Step outside, now," he ordered. I closed the door slightly, trying to think. They didn't look like they were going to leave. I didn't have many options. Grabbing my phone, I texted my colleague, in trouble. "Room 6. Rural motel. Call 911. Then I slowly opened the door again, stepping outside. The men surrounded me, their expressions hard. "We need to know who you're working for," the leader demanded. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, my voice shaking. "I'm just a traveler passing through. Don't lie to us. We know you're involved." "Who sent you?" he barked. Panic surged through me. They thought I was someone else, someone involved in whatever illegal activity they were part of. "I swear, you've got the wrong person. I'm not involved in anything. I don't know who you think I am, but I'm not them," I pleaded. The leader grabbed my arm, squeezing hard. "We don't believe you. You're coming with us." I struggled, trying to pull away. "Let go of me!" I yelled, but it was no use. They were too strong. They dragged me towards a van parked nearby. My heart pounded as I fought to break free, but they shoved me inside and slammed the door shut. The drive felt like an eternity. My mind raced with thoughts of what they might do to me. I had to find a way out. The van eventually stopped, and they pulled me out, leading me into an old abandoned barn. Inside, there were more men, all armed. "Who the hell is this?" one of them asked. "She's the one from the motel. Claims she's not involved," the leader said, pushing me forward. The new man studied me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Maybe she's telling the truth. We can't be sure." "Then what do we do with her?" the leader asked. "Keep her here until we figure it out," he replied. They tied me to a chair, the ropes cutting into my wrists. I sat there, my mind racing, trying to think of a way to escape. Hours passed, and the men argued among themselves. I caught snippets of their conversation. They were part of a local criminal ring, and they thought I was a spy or informant. As dawn approached, the men started to get agitated. They hadn't gotten any information out of me because I had nothing to give. the leader finally decided to call someone higher up. While they were distracted, I noticed a sharp piece of metal on the ground near my chair. I carefully worked the ropes against it, trying to cut through. It took time, but eventually, I managed to free my hands. I waited for the right moment, when they were all focused on the phone call, then slipped out of the chair and bolted for the door. They shouted, realizing I was escaping, but I didn't look back. I ran into the woods, branches scratching my face and arms as I pushed through. I kept running, fueled by fear and adrenaline. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far away as possible. Eventually, I stumbled upon a road and flagged down a passing car. The driver, a kind older woman, took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She drove me to the nearest police station. At the station, I told them everything. They took my statement and promised to investigate. My colleague had indeed called the police, and they were already looking for me. The criminals were arrested later that day, and I was finally safe. The experience left me shaken. I couldn't believe how close I had come to being caught in something terrible, all because of a case of mistaken identity. I had been working the night shift at the old motel in Florida for about 6 months. It was a rundown place, not much traffic, mostly the same regulars and the occasional traveler who got lost or had car trouble. The pay was low, but it was a job, and I needed the money. One of our regulars was a guy named Carl. He'd come in every couple of weeks, always late at night, always paid in cash. He was quiet, kept to himself, never caused any trouble, but there was something about him that always felt off. Maybe it was the way he looked around, like he was expecting something to jump out at him, or the way he never stayed more than one night, always checking out early in the morning. One night, around 2 a.m., Carl came in. I could tell right away something was different. He was sweating, his eyes darting around more than usual. He barely looked at me as he handed over the cash for his room, his hands shaking. I tried to make small talk, but he just mumbled something and headed straight to his room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I watched the security cameras, keeping an eye on his room. About an hour later, I saw him come out and start pacing in front of his door. He looked agitated, kept glancing over his shoulder. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed a stack of towels as an excuse and headed toward his room. As I got closer, I could hear him muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I knocked on the door and called out, "Housekeeping." He opened the door just a crack, and I could see his eyes were wide with fear. "What do you want?" he snapped. "I just brought some fresh towels," I said, holding them up. "Are you okay, sir?" He stared at me for a long moment before nodding and taking the towels. "Thanks," he muttered before shutting the door in my face. I went back to the front desk, more uneasy than ever. I decided to look him up online. I had never bothered before, but something about tonight made me feel like I needed to know more. I typed in his name and the area into the search engine and started reading through the results. My blood ran cold when I saw a news article from a few years back. The photo was unmistakable, it was Carl. Only his name wasn't Carl, it was Daniel Markson, and he was wanted for multiple murders across several states. The article described him as extremely dangerous and likely armed. I felt a wave of panic but tried to keep calm. I was alone at the motel, there was no one to help me if things went south. I considered calling the police right then and there, but I worried about what would happen if Daniel, realized I had made the call. I decided to wait and watch, hoping he would leave soon. But as the hours dragged on, he didn't come out of his room. I couldn't stop thinking about the article, the faces of his victims. I knew I had to do something. Finally, I called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. They told me to stay calm and that they would send someone over right away. The wait felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes glued to the security monitor, praying he wouldn't come out and see me on the phone. When the police arrived, they moved in quietly. I pointed them to his room, and they knocked on the door, identifying themselves. For a moment, there was silence, then all hell broke loose. I heard shouting, a struggle, and then a gunshot. I ducked behind the counter, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear more shouting, but it was muffled. After what felt like forever, things went quiet. I peeked over the counter to see the police leading Daniel out in handcuffs. He looked defeated, his eyes on the ground. One of the officers came over to me and asked if I was okay. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He explained that Daniel had tried to fight them off and had been shot in the leg, but he would be fine. More importantly, he was going back to face justice for his crimes. The police took my statement and left, and I was alone again in the quiet motel. The adrenaline slowly drained away, leaving me exhausted. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, but I was grateful to be alive. In the following days, the motel was buzzing with activity. Reporters came by, and I had to give my statement over and over again. They praised me for my quick thinking, but I didn't feel like a hero. I was just glad it was over. I still work the night shift at the motel, but I'm much more cautious now. I watch the guests more closely and trust my instincts more. I had always loved camping, especially in remote places where you could really feel away from it all. This time, my friends and I decided to camp in a secluded area of the Adirondacks. We wanted a real adventure, away from the usual spots crowded with tourists. We set up our tents near a quiet lake, surrounded by dense woods. The first couple of days were perfect, just us and nature. We hiked, fished, and enjoyed the peace. On the third night, we decided to split up to gather firewood before it got too dark. I wandered off, figuring I knew the area well enough. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me. I lost sight of the camp, but I wasn't worried. I had my flashlight and plenty of time to get back. After gathering a decent pile of wood, I realized it was getting darker faster than I expected. I turned to head back, but the forest seemed different. I tried retracing my steps, but nothing looked familiar. I kept walking, hoping to find a landmark, but it was like the woods were shifting around me. Panic started to set in. I yelled for my friends, but my voice seemed to vanish into the trees. After what felt like hours, I saw a small cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me. Maybe someone there could help. I approached the cabin, noticing it looked old and run down. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the door, and it creaked open. Inside, it was dark and smelled musty. I called out, but still no response. I was about to leave when I heard a noise behind me. I turned and saw a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with a wild look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. "I'm lost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you help me get back to my camp?" He didn't answer, just stepped closer. There was something off about him. His clothes were dirty, and he had a hunting knife strapped to his belt. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said, inching toward the door. "I'll just go." Before I could move, he lunged at me. I ducked and ran out the door, dropping the firewood. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. The woods were dark now, and every shadow seemed to hide him. I found a large tree and crouched behind it, trying to catch my breath. I listened for any sign of him, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. After a while, I started moving again, slowly and quietly. I needed to find my way back to camp. I thought about my friends and hoped they were okay. The fear of that man kept me moving. I stumbled onto a narrow path and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead somewhere safe. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified he would appear out of the darkness. The path twisted and turned, and I felt like I was going in circles. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard voices, familiar voices. I followed the sound and burst into a small clearing. There were my friends, gathered around a fire, looking worried. They jumped up when they saw me, bombarding me with questions. I tried to explain what happened, but I was too shaken to make much sense. All I knew was we had to leave now. We quickly packed up our camp, not wanting to risk another encounter with the man. As we hiked out, I kept looking back, half expecting to see him watching us. The feeling of being hunted stayed with me long after we were safe back home. The experience haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of his wild eyes and the feeling of being trapped in those woods. Camping, something I once loved, now filled me with dread. I still think about that night and wonder who he was and what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. I'm grateful I got out, but the fear lingers, a reminder that sometimes the real danger is just a heartbeat away, hidden in the quiet places we least expect. I was out stealth camping in my van in the Colorado Rockies, seeking some peace and solitude away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It was supposed to be a simple retreat into nature, a chance to disconnect and recharge. But what I found there was far from peaceful. The first night went by without incident. I parked my van in a secluded spot, nestled among the trees, and settled in for the night. The sounds of the forest surrounded me, soothing in their familiarity. I felt safe and at ease, cocooned in the warmth of my sleeping bag. But as the days passed, I began to notice things that didn't quite add up, small, subtle signs that someone else was nearby. Footprints in the dirt that weren't mine, branches snapped in a way that suggested they had been deliberately broken. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but as the days went by, the signs became harder to ignore. One evening, as I was cooking dinner over the campfire, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen for any sign of movement. But the forest was silent, save for the crackling of the flames. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or a bear passing through, but deep down, I knew it was something more. Someone was out there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. I didn't sleep a wink, too afraid of what might happen if I let my guard down even for a moment. The next morning, I decided to confront whoever was out there. I packed up my things and set out into the forest, determined to find out who was watching me and why. I didn't have to look far. Just a few hundred feet from my campsite, I stumbled upon a makeshift shelter hidden among the trees. It was crude but sturdy, made from branches and tarpaulin, camouflaged to blend in with the surrounding foliage. My heart raced as I approached the shelter, my mind buzzing with fear and uncertainty. Who was living here, and why were they watching me? I called out, hoping to coax whoever was inside to reveal themselves, but there was no answer, just the eerie silence of the forest. I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Should I go inside and confront them, or should I turn around and run as fast as I could back to my van? In the end, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped forward, my hand shaking as I reached out to pull back the flap of the shelter. What I found inside chilled me to the bone. The shelter was empty, save for a few tattered blankets and scraps of food, but scrawled on the walls in thick black letters were the words "I see you." I stumbled back, my stomach churning with fear and dread. Who had written those words, and what did they mean? I didn't stick around to find out. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced back to my van. I didn't stop until I was safely locked inside, the engine running as I sped away from that place as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the memory of those words burning in my mind. I see you. It was a chilling reminder that even in the most remote corners of the world, we are never truly alone. I never went back to that spot in the Colorado Rockies. The memory of what happened there still haunts me to this day. A constant reminder of the dangers that lurk just beyond the edge of our comfort zone. But I've learned to be more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and as long as I keep moving forward, I know I'll be okay. We rented a remote cabin in the Canadian wilderness for a week-long family vacation. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. My husband, Mark, our 2 kids, Emily and Jake, and I were looking forward to disconnecting from the world and spending quality time together. The cabin was isolated, nestled among tall trees with a beautiful lake nearby. It seemed perfect. The first couple of days were wonderful. We hiked, swam, and fished. The kids were having a blast, and Mark and I enjoyed the break from our busy lives. The nights were quiet, with only the sounds of nature around us. On the third night, everything changed. We were sitting by the fire, roasting marshmallows, when we heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps. Mark went to check but saw nothing. We brushed it off, thinking it might be an animal. A little while later, we heard it again, closer this time. My heart started to race. Mark looked uneasy but tried to keep calm for the kids. Suddenly, the door burst open, and 3 men stormed in. They had guns. I grabbed Emily and Jake, pulling them close. Mark tried to reason with them, but they shouted for us to be quiet. One of them, the leader I guessed, told us they needed a place to hide for a while. They were on the run, and we were their unlucky hosts. They tied Mark and me up, keeping the kids close to us. My mind raced with fear and desperation. The leader, a tall man with a scar on his face, told us if we cooperated, we wouldn't get hurt. I tried to believe him, but I could see the coldness in his eyes. They took turns watching us. The other 2 men, both younger, seemed nervous, always glancing out the windows. They spoke in low voices, discussing their plans. I caught bits and pieces, enough to know they were dangerous and desperate. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking of ways to escape but found none. The next morning, the men allowed us to eat breakfast under their watchful eyes. Emily and Jake were scared, clinging to me. Mark tried to stay strong, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. As the day went on, I noticed the men were getting agitated. They argued among themselves, their tempers flaring. I knew we had to do something before things got worse. I whispered to Mark, telling him we needed to find a way out. He nodded, his jaw set in determination. That evening, I noticed one of the younger men seemed more sympathetic. He watched us but didn't seem as hardened as the others. I decided to take a risk. When the other men weren't looking, I whispered to him, begging for help. He looked conflicted but didn't respond. Later, when the leader stepped outside, the sympathetic man came over to me. He said he couldn't let us go but would leave the back door unlocked that night. It was our chance. I thanked him quietly, praying he was telling the truth. That night, once the men fell asleep, I whispered to Mark. We untied ourselves carefully, trying not to make a sound. I held Emily, and Mark carried Jake. We crept to the back door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would wake the men. The door was unlocked, just as the man had promised. We slipped outside into the darkness, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The forest was dense, and we stumbled over roots and branches, but we kept going. We had to put as much distance between us and the cabin as possible. After what felt like hours, we reached the lake. We followed its edge, knowing it would lead us back to civilization. The kids were exhausted, but they were brave, not making a sound. I kept looking back, fearing we were being followed. At dawn, we saw a small fishing boat on the shore. Mark checked it and found it was still functional. We climbed in, and Mark started rowing. I held the kids, trying to keep them calm. The boat moved slowly, but it was taking us away from the nightmare we had just escaped. We reached a small town by midday. We found the local authorities and told them everything. They took us in, gave us food and blankets, and assured us we were safe. The police went to the cabin, but the men were gone. They promised to keep looking for them. We stayed in that town for a couple of days, recovering from the ordeal. The kids had nightmares, and so did we. It took a long time to feel safe again. We never found out what happened to the men, but I hope they were caught and couldn't hurt anyone else. That experience changed us. We were more cautious, more aware of the dangers that could be out there. But we were also more grateful for each other. We had faced a terrifying situation and made it through together. That bond, that strength, stayed with us. We never went back to that cabin or any remote places for vacations again. The wilderness that once seemed so peaceful now felt threatening. We stuck to safer, more populated areas, and every time I hear a noise in the night, I remember the cabin and the men who held us hostage. But I also remember how we escaped, and that gives me strength.
What felt like hours, we reached the lake. We followed its edge, knowing it would lead us back to civilization. The kids were exhausted, but they were brave, not making a sound. I kept looking back, fearing we were being followed. At dawn, we saw a small fishing boat on the shore. Mark checked it and found it was still functional. We climbed in, and Mark started rowing. I held the kids, trying to keep them calm. The boat moved slowly, but it was taking us away from the nightmare we had just escaped. We reached a small town by midday. We found the local authorities and told them everything. They took us in, gave us food and blankets, and assured us we were safe. The police went to the cabin, but the men were gone. They promised to keep looking for them. We stayed in that town for a couple of days, recovering from the ordeal. The kids had nightmares, and so did we. It took a long time to feel safe again. We never found out what happened to the men, but I hope they were caught and couldn't hurt anyone else. That experience changed us. We were more cautious, more aware of the dangers that could be out there. But we were also more grateful for each other. We had faced a terrifying situation and made it through together. That bond, that strength, stayed with us. We never went back to that cabin or any remote places for vacations again. The wilderness that once seemed so peaceful now felt threatening. We stuck to safer, more populated areas, and every time I hear a noise in the night, I remember the cabin and the men who held us hostage. But I also remember how we escaped, and that gives me strength.